Cooper had swum in that lake 100 times, but on the first cold morning of October, the golden retriever planted all four paws at the water's edge and began to whine as if someone were calling to him from beneath the surface. Daniel Parker tightened his grip on the leash and stared across the still water, confused by the sudden change in the dog he thought he knew better than anyone. The lake sat just outside the small town of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, tucked behind a walking trail Daniel and Cooper had followed nearly every morning for the past 6 years. It was usually the calmest part of Daniel's day. A 2-mile loop around the shoreline, the scent of pine in the air, and Cooper trotting happily beside him with a tennis ball in his mouth. But that morning, nothing felt normal. The sun had barely risen above the mountains, casting a pale silver light over the glassy water. A thin mist drifted across the surface, and the wooden dock creaked softly in the distance. Cooper, who was normally eager to chase ducks or splash into the shallows, had gone completely still. His ears were raised. His tail was rigid, and his eyes were fixed on a single point near the reeds about 30 feet from shore. "Come on, buddy," Daniel said, giving the leash a gentle tug. Cooper did not move. Daniel frowned. That alone was unsettling. Cooper had always been obedient, almost to a fault. Daniel had adopted him from a rescue shelter when the dog was just 9 months old, and from the very first day, Cooper had stayed close as if he understood Daniel needed him as much as he needed a home. Through every lonely evening, every sleepless night, and every painful anniversary Daniel tried not to think about, Cooper had remained his constant companion. Yet now, for the first time in 6 years, the dog ignored him completely. Cooper stepped forward until the lake water touched his paws. A low, trembling sound escaped his throat. It was not a growl. It was not a bark. It sounded heartbreakingly human, like a cry he had been holding in for years. Daniel felt a chill move down his spine. He glanced around the empty trail. No joggers. No fishermen. No children feeding ducks. Just him, his dog, and the eerie silence pressing in from all sides. "Cooper," he said more firmly. "Let's go." The dog sat down. Then, without taking his eyes off the water, he let out another whine and scratched frantically at the muddy bank. Wet leaves flew behind him. Daniel's pulse quickened. Something about the urgency in Cooper's movements made his chest tighten. The dog was not being stubborn. He was trying to show him something. Daniel stepped closer to the shoreline and followed Cooper's gaze. At first he saw nothing but ripples spreading across the gray water. Then Cooper lunged forward, splashing knee-deep into the lake before Daniel could stop him. The leash jerked violently through Daniel's hands. "Cooper," he shouted, his voice echoing over the water. But the dog kept pulling toward the reeds, whimpering louder now, as though every second mattered. Daniel stumbled after him, his shoes sinking into the cold mud. And then, just as he reached the edge of the water, Cooper froze. The dog lowered his head, stared into the reeds, and began to cry. Daniel had heard Cooper cry before, but never like this. The sound coming from the golden retriever's chest was soft and broken, as if the dog were mourning something he had carried alone for a very long time. Standing ankle-deep in the cold mud at the edge of the lake, Daniel felt an ache rise in his throat. Cooper was not looking at him. He was not waiting for a command or asking for help in the way dogs usually did. His eyes remained fixed on the cluster of reeds swaying gently in the gray water, and tears glistened at the corners of his dark brown eyes. Daniel had always believed that Cooper felt things more deeply than most dogs. From the day he brought him home to the small cedar-sided house on Maple Street, Cooper had seemed unusually sensitive to silence. On nights when Daniel sat awake in the living room, staring at old photographs and trying not to think about everything he had lost, Cooper would climb onto the couch and rest his head on Daniel's lap without making a sound. He never demanded attention. He simply stayed close, as though he understood that some kinds of pain could not be fixed, only shared. Over the years, Daniel noticed that Cooper had developed certain routines that made him wonder what the dog remembered and what he felt. Every evening at exactly 7 o'clock, Cooper would walk into the hallway and sit beside a framed picture of Emily Parker, Daniel's late wife. The photograph showed her smiling beneath a wide-brimmed sun hat, one hand wrapped around Cooper's neck when he was still a young dog. Cooper would stare at the picture for several minutes, his ears relaxed and his expression almost wistful, before quietly returning to his bed. Daniel never encouraged the behavior, but he never interrupted it either. It felt too personal, as if the dog were keeping his own private vigil. Since Emily's passing 3 years earlier, Cooper had changed in subtle ways. He still greeted Daniel at the door and chased squirrels in the backyard, but a certain brightness had faded from him. He slept more than he used to. Sometimes Daniel would catch him standing alone in the guest room that had once been Emily's home office, nose lifted toward the air as if searching for a familiar scent that was no longer there. On difficult days, Cooper seemed to carry not only his own loneliness, but Daniel's as well. That was why the scene at the lake unsettled Daniel so deeply. The trembling in Cooper's body did not feel like fear. It felt like recognition. The dog took one careful step forward and lowered his muzzle to the water. He sniffed the surface, then let out another quiet cry that sounded almost like a greeting. Daniel's chest tightened. He remembered something Emily used to say whenever Cooper waited by the front window for her to come home from work. "He loves with his whole heart," she would whisper, rubbing the dog's ears. And dogs like that never really forget. Daniel knelt beside Cooper and placed a hand on his damp fur. The retriever leaned into him for a brief moment, but his attention quickly returned to the reeds. His body was tense with a strange mixture of hope and sorrow, as if he had finally found something he had been searching for in silence. Then Daniel noticed a worn blue ribbon tangled around Cooper's collar. It was the same ribbon Emily had tied thereon, the last day she ever walked with him to this lake. Cooper suddenly lurched forward and plunged his muzzle beneath the icy surface, blowing frantic streams of bubbles into the reeds, as though he were trying to wake something that had been sleeping there. Daniel grabbed the leash with both hands, his heart pounding as the dog pawed at the water with a desperation he had never witnessed before. Cooper was not playing. He was working. His front legs churned through the shallows, sending mud and dead leaves swirling around them. Every few seconds he would stop, lift his head, and listen with such intense concentration that Daniel found himself holding his breath too, as if there were a sound hidden beneath the gentle lap of the lake. Then Cooper would dive back in and resume his strange search. "What are you doing?" Daniel whispered, but the question was swallowed by the fog. The golden retriever's entire body trembled with urgency. Water streamed from his coat, and his paws scraped furrows into the soft bank. Daniel had seen Cooper become excited before when he caught the scent of a deer or discovered an old tennis ball buried in the yard. But this was different. There was no joy in his movements, only determination and grief. For nearly 20 minutes, Cooper refused to stop. Daniel tried coaxing him with treats from his jacket pocket. He offered the worn red ball Cooper normally would have chased without hesitation. He even unclipped the leash, hoping the dog might calm down if he felt free to move. Instead, Cooper remained rooted to that narrow stretch of shoreline, as if invisible chains held him there. At one point, he waded chest deep into the water and began swimming in a tight circle around the reeds. When he returned to shore, he pressed his soaked body against Daniel's legs and stared up at him with eyes so pleading that Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It was as though Cooper was asking for help, but could not explain what was wrong. Daniel's concern deepened as the days passed. The following morning, before Daniel had even finished pouring his coffee, Cooper was waiting by the front door with the blue ribbon still tied to his collar. He refused. Breakfast, something he had not done since the day Emily died. The moment Daniel picked up the car keys, Cooper rushed outside and leaped into the back seat. At the lake, the same pattern repeated. Straight to the reeds. Straight to the water. Straight to that mournful cry. By the third day, Cooper had stopped sleeping through the night. Daniel heard him pacing the hallway after midnight, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floor. Twice he found the dog standing beside Emily's photograph, whimpering under his breath. On the fourth night, Cooper carried one of Emily's old gardening gloves from the hall closet and placed it carefully beside Daniel's bed. He lay down next to it and rested his head on top of the faded leather, refusing to move until morning. Daniel began to worry that something inside Cooper was unraveling. Perhaps the dog was sick. Perhaps age was affecting his memory. Perhaps grief, which Daniel had always assumed belonged only to humans, had finally become too heavy for Cooper to bear alone. Yet no explanation felt complete, because each time they returned to the lake, Cooper seemed more focused, not less. More certain, more urgent. Then, on the fifth morning, just as Daniel reached for the leash to lead him back to the car, Cooper did something he had never done in 6 years. He seized the blue ribbon on his own collar with his teeth, tore it free, and dropped it directly into the dark water before diving after it. Daniel lunged forward and caught Cooper's leash just as the dog disappeared shoulder deep into the dark water, his jaws snapping shut around the blue ribbon as if it were the most important thing in the world. For one terrifying second, Daniel thought Cooper might keep swimming until he vanished into the reeds. With both hands braced against the slippery bank, Daniel pulled with all his strength until the golden retriever finally turned and paddled back to shore. Cooper emerged shivering and breathless, but instead of dropping the ribbon at Daniel's feet, he clamped it gently between his teeth and backed away. His eyes were wide with a strange, desperate intensity that Daniel did not know how to interpret. "Enough," Daniel said, more sharply than he intended. Cooper flinched, but did not surrender the ribbon. Daniel felt a stab of guilt, followed almost immediately by fear. The dog had not eaten properly in days. He was pacing at night, crying at the lake, and now diving into cold water as if possessed by some memory Daniel could not understand. For the first time, a painful thought crossed his mind. What if Cooper was no longer acting like himself because something was wrong inside his aging body? That afternoon, Daniel drove Cooper to Cedar Ridge Animal Clinic, the same small veterinary office where Emily used to take him for annual checkups. Cooper sat unusually still in the back seat, the damp blue ribbon resting between his paws. He refused to let it out of his sight. At the clinic, Dr. Melissa Grant examined him carefully. She listened to his heart, checked his joints, and ran her hands through his thick golden fur. Cooper cooperated with every part of the exam, but whenever Dr. Grant reached for the ribbon, he lowered his head and covered it with one paw. Daniel watched with growing unease. Dr. Grant removed her glasses and studied Cooper for a long moment. "Physically, he looks remarkably healthy for his age," she said. "But emotionally, something is clearly troubling him." Daniel told her everything. The crying at the lake, the sleepless nights, the refusal to eat, the way Cooper seemed fixated on the reeds as though he believed something was waiting there. Dr. Grant listened quietly, then folded her hands on the desk. "Animals grieve in ways we do not always recognize," she said. "Sometimes they become attached to places or objects that remind them of someone they loved. But if that attachment starts interfering with eating, sleeping, and normal behavior, it can become harmful." The word harmful landed heavily in Daniel's chest. He looked down at Cooper, who was lying at his feet with the ribbon tucked under his chin like a treasured possession. The dog lifted his eyes to Daniel, and in them Daniel saw neither confusion nor aggression. He saw pleading. But Daniel was exhausted and frightened. He had already lost Emily. The thought of losing Cooper too was unbearable. Over the next 2 days, Cooper's behavior worsened. He ignored his favorite treats, stood at the front door before dawn, and whimpered until Daniel drove him back to the lake. Each visit left him more drained and more determined. Daniel stopped sleeping. He began checking Cooper's breathing during the night and searching online for signs of canine dementia and anxiety disorders. Every article seemed to confirm his worst fears. By Friday morning, Daniel felt he had no choice. Dr. Grant had recommended a short stay at the clinic where Cooper could be monitored, sedated if necessary, and kept away from whatever obsession was consuming him. As Daniel clipped on the leash and picked up the car keys, Cooper did not resist. He simply took the blue ribbon in his mouth, looked once toward the lake beyond the kitchen window, and followed Daniel to the door, unaware that his best friend was about to take him away from the one place he seemed desperate to protect. Daniel had just fastened Cooper's seatbelt harness in the back of the truck when his phone rang. It was Dr. Melissa Grant calling from the clinic. "Before you leave town, could you bring that ribbon with you?" she asked. "I know it sounds unusual, but I would like to take a closer look at it." Daniel glanced through the rearview mirror. Cooper was sitting perfectly still, the faded blue ribbon draped across his paws like a sacred object. "You think it matters?" Daniel asked. There was a brief pause on the line. "I am not sure," Dr. Grant admitted. "But sometimes the smallest things tell us what an animal has been trying to say." Daniel turned the truck around and drove to the clinic in silence. Cooper did not whine or pace as he had all week. He simply kept one paw resting on the ribbon, as if guarding it until someone finally understood. In the examination room, Dr. Grant spread the damp ribbon across a stainless steel table under a bright overhead lamp. At first, it looked exactly as Daniel remembered, a narrow strip of blue satin, frayed at the edges and faded from years of sunlight and weather. Emily had tied it around Cooper's collar one spring afternoon as a joke, saying he deserved something handsome for attending their picnic at the lake. Daniel had not thought about that day in years. Dr. Grant adjusted the lamp and leaned closer. "There is something caught in the stitching," she said quietly. Using a pair of tweezers, she lifted a tiny object from one of the ribbon's loose threads. It was no larger than a grain of rice. Daniel squinted. "What is that?" Dr. Grant placed it on a white tray and examined it through a magnifying lens. "It appears to be a piece of waterproof paper." Her voice had changed. The calm certainty in her tone was replaced by curiosity. With remarkable care, she moistened the fragment and unfolded it with the tweezers. Faint blue ink emerged across the surface. Only 3 words were still legible. "Meet me here." Daniel felt the room tilt slightly. Those words struck him with an odd familiarity, though he could not immediately place why. Dr. Grant looked from the fragment to Cooper, who had risen from the floor and was standing beside the table, his tail motionless and his eyes fixed on the tiny piece of paper. The dog was not anxious. He looked hopeful, as if this was the first sign that someone was finally listening. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "That cannot be a coincidence." Dr. Grant nodded slowly. "I do not think Cooper is obsessing over the lake. I think he is responding to a memory connected to this ribbon." Daniel stared at the words again. "Meet me here." The phrase tugged at something buried deep in his mind, something just beyond reach. Emily had loved leaving handwritten notes in unexpected places. Lunch boxes, coat pockets, bathroom mirrors. Sometimes she would tuck small messages into books or under windshield wipers, tiny reminders that turned ordinary days into something warmer. Daniel had treasured every one of them. Yet he had no memory of this particular note. Why would a piece of it be hidden inside Cooper's ribbon? Why would the dog become so desperate to return to the lake now, after all these years? Dr. Grant folded the fragment into a small plastic sleeve and handed it to Daniel. "Whatever happened at that lake matters to him," she said softly, "and possibly to you as well." Cooper stepped closer and pressed his nose gently against Daniel's hand, then touched the sleeve containing the fragment. Daniel looked down at the dog and felt a sudden rush of doubt. What if Cooper had not been unraveling at all? What if he had been trying, in the only way he knew, to lead Daniel back to something unfinished? Daniel slipped the plastic sleeve into his jacket pocket. His pulse quickened as old memories stirred at the edges of his mind. He turned to Dr. Grant, then to Cooper, whose ears lifted the moment he heard the word lake. Daniel took a slow breath and made the only decision that now felt possible. Instead of leaving Cooper at the clinic, he was going back to the water to find out what his dog had been trying to show him all along. The drive back to the lake felt unreal. Cooper stood in the back seat the entire way, his front paws pressed against the center console, his eyes fixed on the road, as if he were afraid Daniel might change his mind. The moment the truck rolled into the gravel parking lot, the golden retriever let out a sharp cry unlike anything Daniel had heard before. It was not a sound of fear. It was a sound of certainty. Daniel barely had time to open the door before Cooper leaped out and sprinted toward the shoreline, the blue ribbon fluttering from his collar once more. The sun was setting now, turning the water bronze and copper. Long shadows stretched across the reeds where Cooper had returned every day. Daniel followed as fast as he could, his boots slipping on the damp earth. Cooper did not hesitate. He plunged into the shallows and swam straight to the same narrow patch of cattails. But this time, instead of circling or digging, he did something entirely different. He reached beneath the water with extraordinary care and lifted something with his mouth. At first, Daniel thought it was just another branch. Then Cooper turned and paddled slowly back to shore, holding the object so gently that not even a ripple disturbed its surface. When he emerged from the lake, he laid it at Daniel's feet and stepped back. Daniel stared in disbelief. It was a small silver tin box, no larger than a recipe card case, its corners dulled by years underwater. A blue satin bow was tied around the handle. Daniel's knees weakened. He recognized that bow instantly. Emily used to tie that exact knot, looping one side slightly longer than the other because she said perfect bows looked too formal. His hands shook as he knelt in the mud. Cooper stood beside him, soaked and trembling, but utterly still. The dog had not brought Daniel to the lake because he was confused. He had brought him here because he remembered. Daniel opened the tin box. Inside, protected by a waterproof sleeve, was a folded letter and a Polaroid photograph. The picture showed Emily sitting on this very dock, laughing as Cooper, still a young dog, balanced awkwardly beside her with the same blue ribbon around his neck. On the back, in Emily's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For the day you are ready to smile here again." Daniel unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. Emily had written it during the final months of her illness, knowing there might be things she would not have the strength to say aloud. She explained that she had chosen this lake because it was where they had felt happiest as a family. She wrote that if Daniel ever found the box, it would mean Cooper had done what she trusted only him to do. "He notices everything," she had written. "When you are too heartbroken to return, I know he will bring you back when your heart is ready." Daniel could no longer breathe normally. His vision blurred as he read the final lines. Emily thanked Cooper by name for being the keeper of one last gift. She wrote that she had hidden the box beneath the reeds during their final walk together and tied a fragment of her note inside his ribbon so he would always carry a reminder. She believed that one day, when Daniel needed her most, their faithful dog would remember what both of them had forgotten. Daniel lowered the letter and looked at Cooper. The golden retriever sat quietly in front of him, tail resting in the mud, eyes filled with the same sorrow and hope he had shown all week. Every sleepless night, every cry, every desperate trip to the lake had not been the behavior of a dog losing his mind. Cooper had been honoring a promise he had carried in silence for 3 years. Daniel pressed the damp letter to his chest and stared at his dog in stunned disbelief, finally understanding that the one he thought needed saving had been trying all along to save him. Daniel remained by the lake until the last trace of sunlight disappeared behind the pine-covered hills. The evening air turned crisp, and the first stars shimmered across the dark water. But for the first time in years, the shoreline no longer felt like a place of loss. It felt like a promise kept. Cooper stayed close beside him, his damp fur slowly drying in the cool breeze, the blue ribbon resting against his chest like a quiet badge of honor. Daniel unfolded Emily's letter one more time and read the final sentence aloud to the dog. "Take care of each other until you can both find your way back here." The words settled gently over the lake, and Cooper lifted his head as if he recognized them. Daniel looked at the old dock, weathered and leaning slightly to one side, and made a decision that felt both simple and profoundly important. Instead of treating this place as a painful memory, he would turn it into something living again. Over the next several days, Daniel returned to the lake with Cooper every morning. But now the visits felt completely different. There was no frantic digging, no mournful cries, and no desperate pulling toward the reeds. Cooper walked with a relaxed confidence, as if his burden had finally been lifted. He no longer raced ahead. He stayed beside Daniel, occasionally brushing against his leg in a gentle reminder that they were doing this together. Daniel brought tools in the back of his truck, a hammer, fresh boards, sandpaper, and a small can of weather-resistant paint. With permission from the town parks department, he began repairing the old dock where he and Emily had once spent so many quiet afternoons. Cooper watched every step of the process with careful attention. While Daniel replaced loose planks and tightened rusted bolts, the golden retriever rested nearby with the silver tin box tucked safely inside Daniel's backpack. Several neighbors who used the walking trail stopped to ask what he was doing. Daniel found himself telling the story, for the first time, not as a story of grief, but as a story of loyalty. Each time he described how Cooper had remembered Emily's hidden message, his voice filled with renewed wonder. By the end of the week, the dock looked stronger than it had in years. Daniel added one final detail. He installed a small cedar bench at the end, wide enough for one man and one faithful dog to sit side by side. On a brass plaque mounted to the backrest, he had engraved a single line from Emily's letter, "Love remembers the way." On Sunday morning, Daniel and Cooper returned before sunrise. Mist drifted across the water just as it had on the day everything began. Daniel spread an old quilt on the bench and placed Emily's photograph beside him. Then he set down a thermos of coffee and a fresh tennis ball for Cooper. The dog climbed onto the bench with surprising care, circling twice before settling against Daniel's side. For several minutes, neither of them moved. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt complete. Daniel rested one hand on Cooper's warm shoulder and felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The tension that had gripped the dog for days was gone. His eyes were half closed, his muscles loose, and his tail gave a slow, contented thump against the wooden boards. Daniel realized that Cooper had needed more than understanding. He had needed proof that his message had been received and that Emily's final gift had found its home. As the sun rose over the lake, painting the water gold, Cooper let out a soft sigh and laid his head across Daniel's lap exactly as he had done during the hardest nights of their lives. This time, however, there was no sadness in the gesture, only peace. Daniel stroked the blue ribbon on Cooper's collar and whispered, "You did it, buddy." The golden retriever closed his eyes completely, secure at last in the knowledge that he had been heard, believed, and cherished for the extraordinary heart he had carried all along. In the months that followed, the bench at the end of the dock became the quiet center of Daniel and Cooper's life. What had once been a place Daniel avoided now turned into the one place where he felt closest to both the woman he had loved and the dog who had refused to let that love disappear. Every Saturday morning, Daniel packed the same simple things into a canvas bag: a thermos of coffee, 2 blueberry muffins from the bakery on Main Street, Emily's photograph in its worn silver frame, and a bright yellow tennis ball that Cooper still carried with the enthusiasm of a much younger dog. They would arrive just after sunrise, when the mist hovered over the water and the world felt soft and unhurried. Cooper always led the way down the weathered planks, but his steps were no longer frantic. The urgency that had driven him for so many sleepless nights had given way to a calm sense of purpose. He had done what he set out to do. He had brought Daniel back. Sometimes other walkers paused at the trail to watch the familiar pair sitting together at the far end of the dock. A few recognized Cooper as the gentle golden retriever with the faded blue ribbon around his collar. Children often asked why the ribbon looked so old, and Daniel would smile and say that some things become more valuable when time leaves its mark on them. Dr. Melissa Grant visited one autumn afternoon and found Cooper resting beside the brass plaque, his muzzle sprinkled with a few more strands of gray. She knelt to scratch behind his ears and laughed softly when the dog nudged the silver tin box Daniel had begun carrying in his backpack wherever they went. "He seems lighter," she said. Daniel nodded. "So do I." As winter approached, Daniel started writing letters of his own. On small pieces of waterproof paper, he tucked messages into the tin box and read them aloud to Cooper at the lake. Some were addressed to Emily. Others were simply notes of gratitude for the dog sitting beside him. Daniel wrote about ordinary things: the first snowfall, the crocuses blooming in the yard, the way Cooper still insisted on sleeping with one paw touching Daniel's foot. These small rituals did not erase grief, but they transformed it into something gentler. Grief was no longer a locked room. It had become a path they walked together. On the anniversary of Emily's passing, Daniel returned to the dock before dawn. He placed a fresh bouquet of wildflowers on the bench and read Emily's letter one final time. Then he folded it carefully and slipped it back into the silver tin box. Cooper climbed onto the bench and rested his head on Daniel's shoulder, his breathing slow and steady. As the first rays of sunlight spread across the lake, a flock of geese lifted from the water and disappeared into the brightening sky. Daniel felt no sharp ache this time, only a quiet fullness. He understood at last that Emily had not left him with one final goodbye. She had left him with a guide. Cooper was growing older now. His muzzle was wider, his pace slower, and his naps longer. Yet every morning he still wore the blue ribbon with unmistakable pride. It fluttered gently against his chest as they walked around the lake, a simple piece of faded satin carrying years of memory, trust, and devotion. Daniel often wondered how long Cooper had held on to Emily's secret and how patiently he had waited for the right moment to reveal it. The answer did not matter as much as the truth the dog had taught him. Love does not always speak in words. Sometimes it waits beside the water, day after day, until the heart it protects is ready to return. Daniel placed his hand over Cooper's and looked out across the still lake where sorrow had become peace. The dog closed his eyes, completely at rest. Some promises are kept on 4 paws.